So, quick backstory. I had a client that wanted to read Google Sheets and perform an action in an ERP website where data that was read from the Google Sheet would then be inserted into the ERP system. This ERP system or website would then return information once that data was entered, and he wanted this data inserted back into the Google Sheet. I did this using Python, so I wanted to do something simpler using Power Automate this time to see how difficult it would be, and it turned out to be rather simple. And here we are. So, reading the Google Sheet is a fairly simple process using Power Automate, and that action that I will perform in this video will be to email certain rows that fall within our criteria. I will be calling a PowerShell script to perform the email, but will highlight in this video how to set up reading a Google Sheet and parsing the data in Power Automate to then perform an action on this data. Okay, let's begin. So, I have a relatively simple Google Sheet here called Test Sheet. We have a few columns, um, action items, rank, priority, owner, assign date, due date, whether it has been completed or not, and status. Status is of how much of the task has been completed. So the task at hand here is if the due date is a specific date, say 6/5/2023, and status is less than 80%, then send an email referencing the owner and the task being due. So those requirements would target every row except task 2 line entry. Okay, so let's go over setting up access to enable a connection to our Google Sheet. First thing is you want to log into your Google Cloud Console and create a project. Once your project is created, go into APIs and Services section. Click on Credentials. You can see here I already have an API key created, but you will click on the plus Create Credentials and select API key. It is going to go through the process of creating an API key. Once you get it, keep it and don't share it. Right now you will see an exclamation point next to it, and that's because it's not restricted and is wide open. I like to restrict it, so you would click on it and under API restrictions, restrict it to Google API Sheets. And save it. I'm not using this key, so I will delete this. But this is the process I did to get my API key here. Once you have that, you will now have to enable Google Sheets API. So click on Enabled APIs and Services. Then click on plus Enable APIs and Services. In the search, type Google Sheets API and click on it. Here you will have a button that says Enable API and click that. I already have it enabled on mine, so it looks like this once it's enabled. And that's all you need to do to enable access to Google Sheets via API. So let's go ahead and open up a new flow in Power Automate Desktop. The first thing we need to do is assign a variable for our key and sheet ID. So expand variables and select the set variable action. Give the variable a new name called API and set the value to the API key you created earlier. Next, let's do the same thing for the sheet ID. Create a new action set variable Change the name to sheet ID. This value can be obtained from the URL of your Google Sheet. Your URL will look like this link here. You will have docs.google.com/spreadsheets/d/some random text/edit. You want to copy everything after the d slash and before the slash edit. This will be your Sheets ID. Once you have this ID, paste it in your Sheet ID value and save it here. Now we will look for the invoke web service action. And in here, set the URL. It is https://sheets.googleapis.com/v4/spreadsheets/ and insert our sheet ID variable, then /values/our sheet ID name that you get from the bottom tab on the spreadsheet. Mine is set to test sheet. Then exclamation point and select the entire range of our data set. So A1 colon H6 in my case. Then question mark key equals, and we call our API key variable. The method will be get. We change our accept to accept anything with */*. The content type will be applications/JSON. Under advanced, you can leave the default as is, but turn off the encode request body and leave everything else as is. Okay, so we have our flows to enable the connection and query on the sheet that returns JSON data. Now let's convert this JSON data to a custom object. There is an action that does this. Next to JSON, select the web service response variable, and this will output to our JSON as a custom object variable. So this as is should pull in all of the values from our spreadsheet. So This, as is, should pull in all the values from our spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. Okay, it completed. Let's look at the values we get in our JSON as a custom object variable. So we have 3 rows here. Our last row, values. If we click more here, we can see all the rows from our Google Sheet listed here. 5 rows in total. Actually 6. Okay, we now have our data in a variable. So we have our 4 flows. Our first flow sets our API key variable. Our second flow sets the Google Sheet ID variable. Our third flow invokes a web service call to the Google Sheet API and references our API key and sheet as it stores the response in JSON format. We then take that JSON response and convert it to an object where all our sheets data resides. Now let's loop over that data. We will use a standard for each loop. Next, the values to iterate, we specify our JSON as a custom object, but we just want to go over our data and not the other values that it captured. So we add values in brackets and quotes. So this will loop over just our values shown here. We need to look at our due date, which will be our 5th entry in the row. Our status, which will be the 7th entry, and our owner, which will be the 3rd entry. Okay, so let's create variables that captures these entries. We will create our first one and call it due date. This will be our 5th entry. Our second variable will be called owner. And this will be our 3rd entry. And the last variable will be our status. And this will be our 7th entry and reference like this. Let's save and run this to see what we get in our variables. We should get the last entry in our sheet because the previous values will be overwritten with each iteration in our loop. So if we want to look at our JSON, our variable should contain the last entry. And we can confirm this. Okay, great. Okay, so now we need to perform checks on whether we action the data set. So let's call an if conditional. So if our due date is equal to 6/5/2023, and we can make this more dynamic, but for the sake of this video, I will hard code this value in. Then we call another if statement, and if our status is less than 80%, then we want to send an email and reference the owner. So I have a PowerShell script that sends an email that takes two parameters. One is the recipient and the other is the subject. So let's call the script. But first, we have to read it into a variable. So look for read text from file action and reference our script here. It will be a single text value. Encoding is UTF-8, and we want this value output to pscript. So now we can call our PowerShell script and reference this variable. Actually, let's pass our to email address as a variable because our script accepts this as a parameter. So we have our to email address in our parameter named email. So now we can call our PowerShell script and reference our to email and owner, which are defined as variables. Okay, great. Save that. Our script will use those variables to send an email and reference the owner in the email. Of course, we can add other fields to this to include more information in the email. Let's also create a list so we can see all the entries that should have received an email. So we can declare the list before the for each loop. I'll change the name to targets and save that. Then we will add the row to our targets. list when we action a row. Okay, let's save that. If we look at our sheet, so target rows that have a due date of 6/5/2023 and a status of less than 80%, and we reference the owner. So all of these rows should be a hit with the exception of this task that is 80% done. So if we run this, let's see what we get. Okay, let's look at our targets. And you can see there task 2 is missing and all others are there. So that's great. We should have received the 4 different emails. So we can see 4 different emails all referencing the owners that fell into our requirements. Let's view our targets again. And great, they all match up. So what are we doing here exactly? We invoke a web service to be able to pull data from our spreadsheet. We then convert that JSON response into an object. We read text from our call email script and store it in a variable. We set our email address and we declare a list. We then loop over all our entries and set variables based on the position in our data set. We then use these values to perform a comparison on whether we target this row or not. If the row meets our requirements, we action. I added this line to get the script to work correctly. We then add the row to our list and run the PowerShell script referencing our target variables. And that's it, folks. So we just configured our Google Sheets to allow API access and use that access to read the data of our Google Sheet. We then parse that data to perform checks, and if a certain criteria is met, in our case being the due date and the status less than 80%, we call an action. The action was to send an email referencing the owner. Well, thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe for more content. This has been brought to you by AIP Solutions.